I'm gonna talk about science communication and why do we want to communicate? There are lots of reasons why scientists should communicate their research. Certainly, all of you are working on public lands, and you kind of owe it to the public to communicate the work that's going on in Acadia. You also might be publicly funded, in which case there's an obligation to communicate back to the public, to the taxpayers, who are ultimately the ones funding your research. You also can counter stereotypes of who scientists are and what science is, help to demystify science, inspire others. You owe it to the earth. Many of you are working on issues of urgent environmental and conservation concern. And so you sort of owe it to the planet you're trying to save to communicate what you're doing and what you're finding. There's also some selfish reasons why it's good to work on your communication skills. And one is it can improve collaboration with other scientists, both within your field and in other fields. It can make your job easier if you're able to communicate. It can help you advance your career. And I realize that we're still in a place, it's ever getting better, but academic institutions especially, and the tenure system are still in a place where they don't always reward and acknowledge the importance of communication and engagement. And when I was teaching, when I was at UMaine, I found that the students, graduate students especially, they wanted it. They wanted communication. They wanted training. They wanted to take my classes, but a lot of times their advisors still wouldn't let them do it. They had to focus on the science, and communication was sort of an afterthought. I do think that that's changing. Are there other, and also it can help you sort of keep your joy and your sanity. Are there other things that that you could think of that aren't on this list of why it's important to communicate your science?
I'd toss out there, I think that communicating ideas or complex concepts or methods in different ways can really help shed light on it for me too, or see what I'm missing, or alternative ways of thinking about it, tackling a problem. So I think it reflects back on what I should be thinking about or improving as well. So it helps the science in and of itself.
Yeah, that's good. I should add that. It will actually improve your science.
I think it also helps support or helps encourage support from other partners, funders. So I think it's important to kind of communicate out there what you're doing and how it's relevant to people, and build that support network that may help you continue your work.
So a little bit about keeping your joy. This is just a quote from Michelle Sharp, talking about how sort of some days it's hard, right? You have a bad day, or your experiment isn't going well, or your field work isn't going well, or your teaching isn't going well, your learning isn't going well, and you're frustrated, and sort of helping to communicate and talk with people maybe outside of the realm that you're working can kind of help you remember why you got into this work, your work in the first place, and kind of keep your motivation. This is Steve Gephardt, and he spent his career working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, trying to restore Atlantic salmon to the Connecticut River. And the salmon restoration program in the Connecticut River was dissolved several years ago. And so Steve, sort of being suddenly out of work and having had this sort of project that ultimately failed, was doing a lot of soul searching and was giving talks about why did the restoration program in the Connecticut River fail. And he said that one of the top 10 reasons why it failed is that the people doing the work lost zeal. So they just got beat down. They lost sight of why they were doing the work in the first place. They didn't feel appreciated. They didn't feel valued. They didn't value their work. And it's really, really important that you not lose your zeal and that you maintain it. And so one of the ways to do that is to communicate and talk about your science and help you remember that joy. So I want you to just take a couple minutes and just think to yourself about that moment. So my Schoodic Institute's bird ecology director, Seth Benz, calls when he talks to people about how when he got into birding, there's a spark bird, which for birders, it's like that first bird that really captivated you and got you into a lifetime of paying attention to birds. And so what was that? Think about that spark moment. It might have been a place, it might have been a person who introduced you to nature. It might have been something that happened in school, an event. And so just kind of think to yourself, what was that moment that started you on the path to bring you to here today? Just take a couple minutes. There's a chipping sparrow outside my window. You probably can't hear it. My windows are closed, but does anybody want to share? You don't have to, but if you want to. I'm going to ask you to keep coming back to this moment. So kind of make a note for yourself. Anybody want to share?
Yep.
Go ahead.
Nice. It was a person that had intense enthusiasm for plants. And we were actually doing a birding project, and I was there to learn about birds because I didn't know that things that didn't move could be interesting. And he was looking through his binoculars and asked what bird he was looking at. He was actually looking at a plant with his binoculars. And that was when, and then a whole bunch of other interactions with him helped me build that enthusiasm for plants.
Thanks. Anyone else want to share?
I'll share mine. I talk about it often. Well, actually, this is the second time. The second thing that got me interested, but I talk about this one more often, is I was on an archaeological dig and I found a piece of pottery, and on the back side of the piece of pottery, there was a thumbnail. And when I realized that my thumbnail was the exact same size, it helped me have a connection to my ancestors that I'd never felt before. So what drives me is that connection and helping other people being able to feel that connection that I had. So that's what drives me.
And how old were you again, Natalie?
15.
15. And Natalie's a great example of I have heard of using that moment as part of her when she presents on her science, which is a good time for me to note that I'm not an expert and that all of you we have a lot to learn from each other. And so please, share your own experiences and I'm going to be looking, to some of you to help me as well. So I continually improve this training every time that I do it. So your feedback as we go will help me improve it. And so Natalie's using that, her kind of moment of joy as part of sharing the story of her research is just very effective. And we'll talk more about that later on in the training. Okay, so this training, when I talk about science communication, I'm really talking about strategic communication, which all that means is it has a specific audience, so an identified who that you're communicating with. It has some kind of desired outcome, a change in knowledge, attitude, or behavior of the audience. You want something to happen as a result of your communication. There's a reason why you're communicating. And then finally, it uses methods, tools, media, formats that are appropriate to the audience and the goal. So this is where the communication is going to happen, when the communication is going to happen, and how it's going to happen. Is it a video? Is it a website? Is it social media? Are you doing a presentation? Are you doing an engagement campaign? Right? All of these formats. And a lot of communication trainings are going to start with that one. They're going to be about hands-on, how to actually do something. That's not what this training is about. This training focuses on 1 and 2, your audience and your purpose. And it's designed to get you up to the point where you're ready for number 3. And you've identified your audience, your purpose, and you know how you're going to reach them. And you're going to create. So each of you is going to have a draft plan at the end of the 6 weeks for the life of your second century stewardship project, maybe beyond, but at least for the next year or 2 of your communication plan. And that's where you might identify some methods or tools. And if you need additional training, a storytelling workshop, a video production workshop, a data visualization workshop, we can support you in participating in that training. But the important thing is that you've identified that that's the correct format or method for communication. Does that make sense? So I want to give an example, just keeping an eye on the time. So this is a brochure that Schoodic Institute recently produced with Friends of Acadia and Acadia National Park. And I want you to think about, here's sort of the outside, parts, right? So it's like a trifold brochure that would be in like a brochure rack. Think about, who do you think is the audience for this? Something like this. Here's more. What do you think is the purpose? Like, why did we do this? The format is obvious. I just told you, right? It's a brochure, it's printed. It's also online. And it might not be immediately clear. Does anybody think they know who the audience for this is?
Park visitors?
Okay. Yeah, but they're not the primary audience. So, and first I'll say this was not right. So this was initiated, not by me, I'll say. And really, and you wouldn't know this. So sometimes the purpose is not obvious, and there might be sort of an internal and an external facing purpose. And so here, really, it was the boards of our respective organizations. So yes, so Friends of Acadia members, certainly. So organizational boards and members, because we wanted to show how these different organizations work together to protect a changing Acadia. And what is our relationship, and what are we all doing, related to climate change? And so the purpose is to show that the organizations are working together on an important issue. You could say, oh, we work together, or you can sort of show that you're doing it. And then the secondary purpose is to talk about how Acadia National Park is changing because of climate change. And then finally, sort of the format. Why in this day and age would you choose to do a printed product and spend money to print something on paper? And that's because a lot of our members, donors, board members might be an older demographic who still appreciates, and responds to print matter. And also they may be dispersed across the country. And so reaching them through the mail is a good way to directly connect. And I'll also just say about print that when I was at Maine Sea Grant, as over the last 20 years as things have shifted online, print pieces become more valuable and appreciated by people because there's fewer of them. And so they do still, I believe that they still have a role. So that's the format, why we chose to do a brochure. It's also something that could go in park visitors, right? So you can sort of reach people that are wandering around a visitor center or an office looking for, waiting in line for the restroom and sort of intercepting them with something that they can pick up and look at. And maybe they won't look at it till they get home that night or home from their vacation, but they have it physically. And then the second reason to do a publication is that that's a news moment. So when something, is new and is sort of printed, as a lot of you may know from peer-reviewed publications, that's sort of a moment that can make something newsworthy. So that's just an example to kind of illustrate audience, purpose, and format. So I want you to think about your purpose in communicating. This is going to be your assignment for the next week. And it's really to get you started, to help make everything else that's in this training relevant, is if you sort of have a clear purpose. And we'll refine it as the weeks go by, and it's going to change over time. But what's different about this training is that it's really specific to research in Acadia and other parks, and it's really specific and tailored to you as individuals and to your specific research projects. And so think about your purpose. So questions to ask yourself if you're still not clear, like, what does she mean by purpose? It's like, what do you want? Like, what do you want? And why do you want that? What is the problem you're trying to solve with your research? Big picture problem. This is the so what of your research. Another way to think about it is, what do you want to change? Like, what's happening now that you wish were different? What do you want your audience to do, to learn, to think, to feel? What are you asking of them? So there's always an audience for any communication, and you're asking them. It's a deal. When you read a novel, that writer is asking something of the reader. So these are just all different ways to ask yourself sort of the same question. And I want you to think about it now and think about it over the next week. Now, these might be suggestions of purpose.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm just curious because I'm just wondering, maybe we'll get into this later, but is there a sequence of audiences that, it's strategic to perhaps focus first on the funders and then on, your community partners and then on K-12? I'm just curious if we should think about prioritizing.
So that's an awesome question. Yes, you should think about prioritizing, but the sequence depends on your purpose, right? So it all depends on your purpose. And once you've identified your purpose, then that's going to help you prioritize audiences. Does that make sense, Bonnie? And sometimes the audience comes first, right? So it's not always like in this order. So you might be for example, you might be invited to give a talk at a local land trust or watershed organization, or the A. Miller Rushing from Acadia National Park might ask you to do a talk to the National Park Service at headquarters, right? So there your audience is first, and then you're going to have to think about, okay, this is my audience. What is my purpose in this particular communication? So it sort of goes both ways, and you've got to be flexible depending on your audience and your purpose. But the purpose that I'm sort of thinking of now is really your like big picture related to your second century stewardship research. What is sort of that main reason or the big why that you're communicating? Looking at these, which on the surface kind of look like a purpose, and these were taken from the pre-workshop survey. And I think for each of these, I would push back and go deeper. So why do you want your work to be approachable? Why do you want your work to be useful? Why do you want to make sure that your research is responsive to management? That suggests that there's something that needs management, right? There's something that needs to be managed. And so what is that? And that's the real why and the purpose. Why do you want to have a compelling message? Why do you want people to feel that it applies to their life? Why do we need to look at different scales when managing forests? If I was having a one-on-one conversation with you, this is what I would be pushing you on. But why? Like a 3-year-old. Why do you want to shed light on issues that often get overlooked? What is getting overlooked and what are the consequences, right? So think about the consequences of you not communicating this science. Does anyone sort of just some, we have a few minutes for discussion, just kind of any of you who recognize your answer here or are struggling or think or have one you want to try. So we're going to be doing a lot of testing messages with each other and kind of practicing. So if anybody wants to kind of talk through their purpose. Or still have questions.
I think I have more thinking to do.
Yeah.
So I wrote that second to last one. I think there's less we gain by looking at those smaller and larger scales than most people are able to consider when managing forests. Especially with the smaller scale ones. Like, well, why does that actually matter? Do they actually need that understanding? It's fascinating, really interesting, I would argue, but some people maybe don't need that understanding. So.
Yeah.
I want to change the perception of past Indigenous peoples, humanize them.
All right.
I didn't put that in my grant.
Well, but that, right, but and that's your underlying, right? So you've identified that, and I think Bonnie, your whole team, you and Natalie and Isaac, you've had pretty clear, sort of those communication goals from the outset. But I think knowing that that's your implicit purpose, right? And that's sort of the thing that's behind everything you're doing. And you might have a lot of different communications products, but that's the underlying purpose that's kind of supporting all of it.
So I see that in some way, I see it in some ways, this is sort of the in getting in touch with this purpose or the why, it can be that little nugget that maintains your motivation, even if that why is never surfaced in a way that anybody sees. To go back to those kind of maintaining your joy example, I see that keeping that why at top of mind for us could be important motivation.
And can help you when you do get lost, right? You can always, you have that place to sort of come back to. Can help you know when to say yes and when to say no to things. I think there was someone else gonna say something.
I don't remember. It looks like I could have written either the first or the second one. I don't know which one I did, but I am thinking about the why. Water quality affects everybody. We all depend on good water quality. And in Acadia Lakes, several of the lakes are drinking water sources, and they're sources of recreation, and they're important ecologically and aesthetically. So I think for me, that's kind of what it comes down to, is that the water quality of Acadia Lakes and lakes and other parks too is really important for everybody.
I'm gonna steal that. So I can say the same thing about trees, right? Thanks, Rachel.
See, I can't steal that because these stars are a little bit more difficult for people to come to the conclusion that they're important. And I sort of struggle with that often. You know, how far back do I have to go? You know, do I have to explain what a keystone species is? You know, that kind of thing, just to begin to talk about the actual research that I'm doing. And so I wrote maybe the first one, I don't know, but definitely the one about genomic research on invertebrates. Surprise, surprise. And yeah, I guess I have found ways to talk about this with people, but I often find that the actual projects that I do, I end up talking about them for very little. And I end up spending a lot of time just giving basic information about the ecological importance of these species, because you sort of feel the need to qualify why you decided to pick this sort of obscure species. And they have their own inherent value, in my opinion, but you always have to sort of equate these things with things that everyone finds valuable, like fish or, you know, water quality again, or yeah. So that's something that I'm excited to spend some time thinking more about through this training.
I am too. I've done, there's researching how to communicate biodiversity, right? I think it speaks to some of that same challenge. And so I am going to share some examples, and I think we'll all, you know, it is maybe sort of harder in some ways, but depending on your purpose, I mean, you can use your research. So maybe it's more about representation in science, or about why do creatures matter, and less about your science, right? So that's where the really thinking about your sort of purpose and your joy, you can use the science to really be communicating a different message. Or we can dig into really your science, you know, it's really whatever you want. There's no right or wrong answer. We're just here to help you all like get to that, help you get to your message, so that you can achieve your purpose successfully.
I didn't write number 2, but I think it's really important, and the purpose of why to have like work be approachable is, I think, especially this is kind of like a societal problem, but there's a very like us versus them mentality, and I think with science and like the general public especially, like there's I don't want to say an intimidation factor, but some people may be intimidated by, you know, a wall of text, or, you know, like these studies and stuff, because one, they may not understand it completely because of like, you know, jargon and stuff like that. But I think being approachable is very important in, you know, every day-to-day life. I feel like everyone should be approachable, but especially in science, if you want to get your point across to people, because that's where the change happens, and that's when you get the general public behind you, you have more of a sway and you have more influence in your projects and stuff like that. So I think that's a very important purpose. Well, that would kind of be the purpose, is to get more community support in being approachable. You know, you don't want to be standing in a corner, you know, arms crossed and stuff like that. You really want to try and get everyone involved and be a community player.
Great, Liam. So that's so you, over the course of talking, you started out with, I want to make it approachable, but then you ended with, I want support for my research, right? So if that's your goal, and making science accessible is less scary, is sort of how you're getting there, right? So the purpose is really to get public support, whether that's for what your research is aiming to address, or the research itself, And that I want to make it accessible would be later on when we get into sort of messaging and framing, that would be the approach that you use to that, to try to reach that purpose. I also think that just making science less scary, that can be a purpose on its own. So it doesn't have to be a way, it can be, because there your purpose is expanding the community of people who do science, right? And so that's another sort of broad goal where making science less scary is a purpose in itself. All valid, yeah.
So I'll tag on to, I really liked Rachel's. I think I probably wrote the third one because that's where my head has been. But I really want as many people and institutions to be at the table as possible. There's like coming in from the outside, the one advantage is I can see where there's not communication between, for example, the state and the Fed and the general public, and to bring everyone back together, because otherwise anything that we do that can inform maybe improvements for the things that we care about, it's not going to work. And so getting lots of folks at the table and talking to each other, I think is really, really important for all of those reasons. And they care, like everyone, the nice thing is like for that, for water quality, for it's all connected. The sea stars are connected. And so to try to make those connections among all of us and the public and the managers that exist also in the ecological world, I think is just really important.
So similar to Liam's comments, there's sort of two in there, right? There's bringing everybody back together, but why, right? Why is that important? And so that why, the answer to that why question is the deeper purpose. And how you're going to do that is by bringing everybody back and getting networking and internal communications among all the different groups happening again is how you're going to reach that. Why is it important that all those people come back together and talk? Right? You see the difference? Yeah. So I want go deeper to that. Like, why does that matter? Why do we need, like, to the fish, right? Obviously. This is really about the fish in the lake. And that.
So it always feels to me though, like if you start there, if you start at the ultimate, like, I just want to save the fish, that it's too general. And it's not as understandable or accessible. Like sometimes I feel like you want, like that, I want to walk through the logic of like, here's why I want to do this. That is my ultimate goal. But if I just say my ultimate goal, I sound crazy.
Well, I challenge that assumption. And hopefully this training, we're gonna like talk about that, right? That's how a scientist thinks. You wait till the end to put your conclusions in, right? And really this matters for the future of planet Earth, right? Is always like buried at the bottom of the paper, right before the references, right? But we have to start in communicating beyond, right? So it depends on your audience, whether or not you would say, like, I care about fish. It depends on your audience, but knowing that that's the ultimate purpose, right, is going to sort of help you, and just identifying it and just admitting it and sort of acknowledging it is okay. And I think that for some audiences, starting with that is the right place to start, or a good place to start. There's no right and wrong. Okay, this is great discussion. Oh, there's a comment. Let's see. Okay, Sea Star Love in the chat. Yes, if Rachel didn't have laryngitis, I would have asked her to share her spark moment. So we'll have to save that for another time. Okay, so for next week, fellows, you can bring your students in and do a joint presentation, but each fellow project, a 6-minute presentation, you will be timed. I will cut you off if you go over 6 minutes on your second century stewardship project. Because we're going to be helping each other with messaging, it's important that we help, that we are familiar with each other's science. And then so the only thing, and you don't even, if you just want to talk, you can talk if you have slides. you should end with the draft of your purpose. So some of you have shared statements. Some of you still need to do some thinking. Again, all of this stuff is going to get refined throughout the workshop. Nothing is set in stone, but share with us your sort of first draft of what you think your purpose is. And that's going to help us help each other throughout the training. Any last words? Okay. Thank you, everybody. Great first session. I will send reminders and see you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.